Imagine saying goodbye to someone you love, never knowing that moment would haunt you for nearly 3 decades. In 1982, taxi driver Robert Leary kissed his wife goodbye and drove into the night, then vanished without a trace. We all fear the questions that never get answered, the mysteries that steal our peace. But what investigators discovered 28 years later would shatter every theory, expose a stunning truth hidden in plain sight, and prove that sometimes the impossible becomes reality. Before we start, comment below where you're watching from. Let's see who's from your area. Robert Leary was the kind of man people trusted without thinking twice about it. He had warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, which was often. At 34 years old, he'd been driving a taxi for nearly 8 years, navigating the streets like he'd drawn the maps himself. His wife, Linda, always said he could find his way blindfolded. Neighbors knew him as the guy who'd help you jumpstart your car on a cold morning or carry groceries for elderly folks without being asked. He wasn't trying to be a hero. That's just who Robert was. Reliable, steady, the kind of person you'd want in your corner. His taxi, a well-maintained sedan with over 200,000 miles on it, was like a second home. Robert kept it spotless. No fast food wrappers stuffed under seats, no mysterious stains on the upholstery. He took pride in his work, treated every passenger with respect, and had built up a loyal group of regular customers who'd request him specifically. Some drivers saw their job as just shuffling people from point A to point B. Not Robert. He saw himself as part of the fabric of his community, someone who kept things running smoothly behind the scenes. Linda often teased him about knowing half the town by name. It was February 1982, and winter had settled in with that bone, deep cold, that makes you appreciate a warm car. Robert had the evening shift that night, the kind where the city gets quiet and most folks are already home with their families. Before he left, Linda made him his favorite meal, meatloaf with mashed potatoes. They sat together at their small kitchen table, talking about ordinary things, their daughter's upcoming birthday party, the leaky faucet in the bathroom that Robert promised to fix over the weekend, Linda's mother, who was recovering from a bad flu. These were the comfortable rhythms of married life, the kind of conversations that feel almost forgettable in the moment, but become precious when you realize they were the last ones you'd ever have. Robert finished his coffee, grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door, and kissed Linda on the forehead. She remembers the roughness of his work jacket, the faint smell of aftershave mixed with coffee. He told her he'd be home by 2 in the morning, maybe earlier if the night was slow. The door closed behind him with a soft click. That was it. That was the last time Linda Leary saw her husband. But here's what nobody understood then. Robert didn't just disappear that night. Something happened that would turn this simple goodbye into a mystery that would consume decades and dozens of lives. At first, when Robert didn't come home by 2:30, Linda wasn't worried. Sometimes dispatch kept drivers out longer if there was unexpected demand. By 3 o'clock, she felt the first flutter of concern in her chest. By 4, she was pacing the kitchen floor, watching the phone like it might ring through sheer force of will. At 4:30, she called the taxi company. The dispatcher, a woman named Carol who'd worked there for 15 years, sounded confused. According to her records, Robert had checked in for his shift at 6 that evening, picked up 3 fares between 6:15 and 8:30. Then, nothing. No radio contact. No check-ins. It was like he'd driven off the edge of the earth. Carol assured Linda this wasn't completely unusual. Sometimes radios malfunctioned. Sometimes drivers forgot to check in if they got busy. But there was something in Carol's voice, a hesitation that Linda picked up on immediately. By dawn, Linda had called the police. The officer who took her report was sympathetic, but not particularly alarmed. Adult men, especially those who worked irregular hours, sometimes stayed out all night for reasons they'd rather not explain. Maybe he stopped for drinks with friends. Maybe there was car trouble and no nearby phone. Maybe, and the officer didn't say this, but Linda heard it in the pause. Maybe Robert had reasons for not coming home. Linda's face flushed with anger at the implication. Robert wasn't like that. They had a good marriage, a strong marriage. He called if he was going to be even 20 minutes late. The officer wrote everything down and promised they'd keep an eye out for the taxi. By the second day, when Robert's taxi still hadn't turned up and he'd missed his daughter's birthday party, without a word, the police began taking the disappearance more seriously. They interviewed Linda extensively. They talked to Robert's coworkers at the taxi company. They reached out to his friends, his family, anyone who might know something. And here's where the story gets strange. Everyone told the same story. Robert was happy. Robert was reliable. Robert had no problems with money, no secret vices, no enemies they could think of. He wasn't the type to just walk away from his life. The police obtained Robert's work records and traced his movements on that last night. His first fare was a regular customer, an older gentleman who needed a ride from his home to the downtown area for a card game he played every Thursday. Robert dropped him off at 7:10. The second fare was a young couple heading to a restaurant to celebrate an anniversary. They remembered Robert because he'd congratulated them warmly and refused their tip, saying anniversary money should go toward dessert. That fare ended at 7:50. The third and final fare was a businessman who'd asked to be driven across town to a residential neighborhood. The man had seemed normal, professional, carrying a briefcase. Robert dropped him off at 8:25. After that, Robert radioed dispatch to say he was heading to a nearby area where he often found late evening fares. And then silence. The police interviewed that businessman extensively. His name was Thomas Garrett, and he worked in insurance. He had a solid alibi for the rest of the night. He'd been attending a dinner party at the house where Robert dropped him off, and a dozen witnesses confirmed he'd been there until well after midnight. Thomas remembered Robert as friendly and professional. He hadn't noticed anything unusual about his demeanor or the taxi. Nothing seemed off. So where did Robert go after 8:30? That became the question that haunted everyone involved in the case. The police expanded their search. They checked hospitals in case Robert had been in an accident and was unconscious or suffering from amnesia. They checked morgues. They put out bulletins to surrounding areas, asking other departments to be on the lookout for both Robert and his taxi. Days turned into weeks. Linda stopped sleeping properly, surviving on coffee and the desperate hope that each phone call might be the one that brought news. Friends and neighbors organized search parties, walking through parks and wooded areas, checking abandoned buildings. The taxi company offered a reward for information leading to Robert's whereabouts. Local newspapers ran his photograph with headlines asking, "Have you seen this man?" Tips came in, as they always do in high-profile missing person cases. Someone claimed to have seen a taxi matching Robert's description at a rest stop 2 states away. That lead went nowhere. Another person swore they'd seen Robert at a bus station, looking disheveled and confused. Police followed up, but the person couldn't provide any details that checked out. One particularly cruel caller told Linda they knew where Robert was, but would only reveal it for money. Police traced the call to a pay phone, but the extortionist never made contact again. It was just someone trying to profit from a family's pain. Here's what made the case so frustrating for investigators. There was no evidence of foul play, but there was also no evidence that Robert had left voluntarily. His bank accounts remained untouched. His paychecks sat uncashed. Credit cards showed no activity. He hadn't withdrawn any large sums of money before disappearing. His clothes, his personal belongings, everything was still at home. If Robert had planned to start a new life somewhere else, he'd done so without taking a single thing with him, except his work jacket and wallet, and his taxi. That missing taxi became almost as famous as Robert himself. Police put out alerts to every impound lot, every junkyard, every place a vehicle might end up. They checked ferry crossings, border checkpoints, anywhere a taxi might be noticed. Nothing. It was as if both man and machine had simply ceased to exist. By the 6-month mark, the active investigation began to wind down. Police had followed every lead, interviewed everyone they could think of, and come up empty. The file remained open, technically, but resources were diverted to newer cases. Linda refused to accept that Robert was gone. She kept his clothes in the closet, his toothbrush by the sink. She celebrated their anniversary alone, setting a place for him at the table. Friends worried about her, gently suggesting she might need to start thinking about moving forward. But how do you move forward when you don't know what happened? When there's no body, no goodbye, no closure of any kind. Their daughter grew up with a ghost for a father, a smiling face in photographs, and stories told by a mother who refused to use past tense when talking about him. Years passed. 5 years, 10 years, 15. The case grew cold in the way these things do. New detectives came onto the force who'd never worked the case firsthand. Files got moved to long-term storage. Linda aged, the weight of not knowing carving lines into her face that had nothing to do with time. She never remarried. How could she, when part of her still believed Robert might walk through the door one day with a reasonable explanation for everything? By the 20-year mark, most people in town had forgotten about Robert Leary. Newer residents had never heard the story. The case had become local legend, the kind of thing old-timers mentioned occasionally. Remember that taxi driver who vanished back in the 80s? Whatever happened with that? Linda had tried to keep his memory alive, reaching out to police every few years to ask if there were any new leads, any new techniques that might help. DNA analysis was becoming more sophisticated. Missing person databases were going digital. Cold case units were being formed in departments across the country. But none of it helped. There was nothing to test, no DNA to analyze, no body, no crime scene. Just an empty space where a man used to be. And then, 28 years after Robert Leary drove off into that cold February night, a group of hunters made a discovery that would change everything. It was early autumn, the kind of crisp morning when the air smells like fallen leaves and possibility. 3 friends had driven out to a remote area for deer season, somewhere they'd never been before. The land was heavily wooded, the kind of place where nature had reclaimed whatever human presence might have existed decades earlier. They were setting up their equipment when one of them, a man named David, noticed something strange through the trees. At first, he thought it was just an odd-shaped rock or maybe an old piece of farm equipment rusting away. But something about it nagged at him. The color was wrong. Too uniform, too manufactured. He called his friends over, and together they pushed through thick underbrush to get a closer look. What they found stopped them cold. Covered in decades of rust, nearly consumed by vegetation, sitting at the bottom of a steep ravine, was a car. Not just any car, a taxi, its faded paint barely visible under the damage. David pulled out his cell phone and called the police. When the first officers arrived and began carefully making their way down to the vehicle, they discovered something that made this more than just an abandoned car. There were human remains inside. After 28 years, Robert Leary had been found. The news hit the town like an earthquake. Linda, now in her 60s, received the call from a detective who'd been a teenager when Robert disappeared. She'd been waiting for this call for most of her adult life, and yet somehow it still felt impossible. The police launched a full investigation into the vehicle and remains. The taxi was registered to the company Robert had worked for, and the license plate matched records from 1982. Dental records confirmed what everyone already knew. The remains were Robert Leary. But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody expected. As investigators carefully documented the scene and worked to reconstruct what had happened, they discovered something crucial. Something that changed everything everyone had believed for nearly 3 decades. The taxi's position at the bottom of that ravine, the damage pattern on the vehicle, the location itself, all of it told a story. And it wasn't the story anyone had imagined. Remember how everyone assumed Robert had met with foul play, how the theories ranged from robbery gone wrong to random violence to elaborate conspiracies. Every single one of those theories was wrong. The evidence showed that Robert had been driving along a rural road that night, a road that wound through areas with minimal lighting and no guardrails. Weather records from February 1982 confirmed that it had been snowing that night. With temperatures dropping below freezing, the road would have been treacherous, especially after dark. Investigators determined that Robert's taxi had simply slid off the road. Maybe he'd been going too fast for conditions. Maybe he'd swerved to avoid an animal. Maybe the tires had hit a patch of black ice. Whatever the specific trigger, the result was catastrophic. The taxi had gone over the edge of the ravine, tumbling down a steep embankment before coming to rest at the bottom. The impact would have been severe. Medical examiners, working with the limited remains and evidence available, concluded that Robert had likely died on impact or very shortly after. He wouldn't have suffered long. But here's the part that made everyone involved in the case feel sick with guilt and frustration. The ravine where Robert's taxi landed was deep and heavily wooded. It was in an area with no nearby homes, no regular foot traffic, nothing that would bring people to that specific spot. The road above was rural and lightly traveled even in 1982. In the nearly 3 decades since, it had become even more isolated as development moved to other areas. Search parties in 1982 had focused on more populated areas, places where Robert might have stopped for gas or food, routes he was known to take regularly. Nobody had thought to search remote, rural roads in the opposite direction from where he'd last radioed in. The police had made assumptions based on where Robert should have been, not where he actually was. And because the taxi went off the road in darkness, probably during snowfall, there were no skid marks visible. No witnesses drove by and noticed fresh damage to roadside vegetation. By morning, any tracks or disturbances were covered by fresh snow. Within days, they would have been invisible. Within weeks, nature began the slow process of reclaiming the site. Over 28 years, the taxi became part of the landscape. Vines grew over it. Leaves covered it each fall. Rust consumed the metal. It became just another forgotten thing in the woods, and Robert Leary became just another missing person case that went cold. When this information came out, Linda's reaction surprised some people. She wasn't angry at the police for not finding him sooner. She wasn't bitter about the 28 years she'd spent in limbo. Instead, she felt something that looked almost like relief. After 3 decades of not knowing, she finally had answers. Robert hadn't left her voluntarily. He hadn't been the victim of some terrible crime. He hadn't been suffering somewhere, held against his will. He'd simply been driving on a winter night. Conditions had been dangerous, and he'd had an accident. It was terrible and tragic, but it was understandable. It was something she could process. The funeral finally happened 28 years late. Friends and family who'd attended Robert's memorial service back in 1983, when Linda had decided she needed some form of closure, attended again. Robert's daughter, now in her 30s with children of her own, finally got to say goodbye to the father she barely remembered. The town came together in a way it hadn't in years, united by the strange, sad conclusion to a mystery that had haunted them for so long. But even with the body found and the basic facts established, questions remained. Questions that bothered investigators and armchair detectives alike. Why had Robert been on that particular road? It wasn't on his usual route. It wasn't the way to the area where he'd told Dispatch he was heading. He was an experienced driver who knew the roads intimately. So what had taken him to that remote stretch of pavement on a snowy February night? One theory emerged during the investigation. Police discovered that Robert had received a call on his taxi radio around 8:30 that night, right after dropping off his last known fare. The call had come from someone requesting a pickup at an address on the outskirts of town. The address was legitimate, and the road where Robert crashed would have been a reasonable route to get there. The problem was that the person who'd made that call never came forward, not in 1982, and not after Robert's body was found. Investigators tried to track down who might have been at that address in 1982, but the property had changed hands multiple times. Records were incomplete. The taxi company's dispatch logs from that night had been destroyed years earlier as part of routine record disposal. Nobody could definitively say whether that call had been real or whether it had somehow been an error, a prank, or something more sinister. This leads to what still bothers some people about the case. If someone called for a taxi that night and Robert died trying to reach them, why didn't that person report it? If they'd been waiting for a taxi that never showed up, wouldn't they have called the company to complain? And if they'd heard about Robert's disappearance in the news coverage that dominated local headlines for months, wouldn't they have come forward to say they might have been his last contact? There are innocent explanations. Maybe the caller fell asleep and forgot they'd requested a taxi. Maybe they'd been drinking and didn't remember the next day. Maybe they'd called multiple taxi companies and another driver reached them first. Maybe they were just passing through town and left before the news of Robert's disappearance broke. Or maybe, some investigators quietly wondered, there was something more to it. What if someone had deliberately given Robert directions to that dangerous road, knowing what might happen? What if this wasn't a simple accident at all, but something more calculated? But here's the problem with that theory. It requires a level of premeditation that doesn't match any of the evidence. For someone to murder Robert this way, they would have had to know his schedule, know the roads well enough to pick a dangerous stretch, know that weather conditions would make it treacherous, and somehow convince Robert to take that route. They would have had to do all of this without leaving any evidence of motive or means. Robert had no enemies. His finances were clean. His marriage was solid. He wasn't involved in anything illegal or risky. There was simply no reason for anyone to want him dead. And if someone had wanted to harm him, there were far more reliable methods than hoping he'd crash his car on a dark road. The medical examiner found no evidence of foul play, no bullet wounds, no signs of blunt force trauma beyond what would be expected from the crash itself, no indication of poisoning or drugs in the remains. Everything pointed to a tragic accident, nothing more. Still, the mystery caller haunts the case like a ghost. Someone out there knows they called for a taxi on February 18, 1982, and Robert Leary died trying to reach them. That person has lived with that knowledge for over 40 years now. Maybe they don't even realize the connection. Maybe they've known all along, and the guilt has eaten at them. Maybe they're long dead themselves. We'll probably never know. The investigation eventually closed with the ruling of accidental death. Robert Leary had lost control of his vehicle on a winter night and died in a crash that wasn't discovered for nearly 3 decades. The case was solved not by brilliant detective work or new technology, but by random chance. 3 hunters who happened to walk in the right direction on an autumn morning. If they'd set up their equipment 30 yards in a different direction, Robert might still be out there, undiscovered. His family would still be waiting for answers that would never come. Think about that for a moment. Think about how many missing people might be out there, just off the beaten path, waiting to be found by accident. How many families are living the same nightmare Linda Leary lived, not knowing if their loved one is alive or dead, suffering or at peace. The National Missing and Unidentified Persons System lists thousands of cases, and those are just the ones officially reported and entered into databases. The true number of people who vanished without explanation is impossible to know. Some of them, like Robert, aren't missing in the way we usually think about it. They're not being held somewhere. They're not living secret lives under assumed names. They're not victims of elaborate crimes. They're simply resting in places where nobody thought to look. They're stories waiting to be discovered by chance. After Robert's funeral, Linda did something unexpected. She started volunteering with organizations that helped families of missing persons. She said she wanted to turn her decades of pain into something useful, something that might ease someone else's suffering. She became an advocate for better search techniques, for more resources devoted to missing person cases, for keeping cases active even when they go cold. She spoke at conferences, sharing her story with law enforcement and search and rescue teams. She emphasized one point over and over: never assume you know where someone is or isn't. Search everywhere. Check impossible places. What seems unlikely might be exactly what happened. Her advocacy led to changes in how some departments handled missing person cases. More thorough grid searches, better coordination between agencies, improved use of aerial surveillance and ground, penetrating radar in wooded areas. If Linda Leary's tragedy could prevent even one other family from enduring 28 years of not knowing, she felt it was worth it. Her daughter dealt with the discovery differently. She'd grown up with an absence, a father-shaped hole in her life filled with stories and photographs, but no real memories. For years, she'd held onto a secret hope that maybe he'd come back, that maybe he'd had amnesia or been held somewhere against his will. Finding his body meant letting go of that hope. accepting that he'd been gone all along. She wrote about the experience in a local newspaper, describing the strange grief of mourning someone who'd been dead for 3 decades. How do you process loss when it happened before you were old enough to understand it? How do you grieve for someone you never really knew? She wrote about the guilt she felt for not remembering him better, for the way his face in photos had become more familiar than any actual memory of him. She wrote about the anger she felt toward circumstances, toward the weather, toward the road, toward fate itself. And she wrote about the small measure of peace that came with knowing the truth, however terrible it was. The response to her article was overwhelming. People from across the country reached out, many of them with their own stories of loss, of missing loved ones, of questions without answers. She realized her experience, while deeply personal, was also universal. The need to know what happened to someone we love is fundamental to human nature. We can endure almost anything if we understand it, but uncertainty is its own special torture. In the years since Robert's discovery, the site where his taxi was found has become something of an unofficial memorial. People leave flowers there occasionally, though nobody's quite sure who's doing it. Maybe it's Linda, making the drive out to where her husband spent his last moments. Maybe it's his daughter, trying to connect with the father she never got to know. Maybe it's others who've lost people and find some comfort in marking a place where someone missing was finally found. The road above the ravine hasn't changed much. It's still narrow, still winding, still dangerous in winter. Local authorities did add a guardrail after Robert's taxi was discovered, a small measure that might prevent future tragedies. There's no historical marker, no sign explaining what happened there. Just a guardrail and a ravine and woods that keep their secrets until someone stumbles onto them by accident. The taxi company Robert worked for closed down years ago, unable to compete with modern ride-sharing services. Carol, the dispatcher who took Linda's call that night in 1982, passed away before Robert was found. She died not knowing what had happened to the driver she'd worried about all those years ago. Many of the police officers who worked the original investigation have retired or died. The case file sat in storage, gathering dust for decades, a symbol of failure, of questions without answers. Now it's closed, archived as solved, but it still bothers some of the investigators who worked it. They feel they should have found him sooner. They question the assumptions they made, the search parameters they set, the areas they dismissed as unlikely. It's easy to see the mistakes with hindsight. Of course they should have searched rural roads, even if they weren't on Robert's usual route. Of course they should have considered that he might have taken a call directing him somewhere unexpected. Of course they should have been more thorough. But investigations work within limitations. Time, resources, manpower, information. You can't search everywhere. You have to make educated guesses about where to focus efforts. Sometimes those guesses are wrong, and a case goes unsolved not because of incompetence, but because of the sheer impossibility of searching every square mile of countryside. This is what haunts the people who knew Robert. If one small thing had been different, if the weather had been better, if the call had come 10 minutes earlier or later, if Robert had taken a slightly different route, if he'd been driving a bit slower, he might have made it home that night. He might have watched his daughter grow up. He might have become a grandfather, retired, grown old with Linda. But that's not how it happened. Instead, a series of small, unremarkable circumstances aligned in exactly the wrong way, and a good man died alone in the dark. Here's something most people don't talk about with cases like this: the survivor's guilt experienced by people who had nothing to do with what happened. Linda spent years wondering if she should have insisted Robert not work that night. It was cold. The weather forecast had mentioned possible snow. Should she have asked him to stay home? Would he have listened? His daughter wondered if things would have been different if her birthday had been the day before instead of the day after he disappeared. Would he have taken that night off to be with family? The dispatcher wondered if she should have tried harder to reach Robert when he didn't check in. Should she have sent another driver to look for him immediately instead of waiting until morning? These are the kinds of questions that eat at people, even though, rationally, they know none of this was their fault. Nobody could have predicted what would happen. But guilt doesn't follow rational patterns. It settles in the spaces between what happened and what we wish had happened, and it stays there for years. Thomas Garrett, the businessman who'd been Robert's last known fare, was questioned extensively in 1982, and again after the body was found. He'd done nothing wrong, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow connected to Robert's death. He'd been the last person to see him alive, the last person to speak with him. For years afterward, Thomas avoided taking taxis when possible, and when he had to, he'd find himself watching the driver, wondering about their life, their family. He'd tip generously, compulsively, as if making up for something even though there was nothing to make up for. He died in 2008, never having fully resolved his own complicated feelings about being tangentially connected to tragedy. This is the ripple effect of loss. It touches people in ways that aren't always obvious, creating waves of grief and guilt and complicated feelings that spread far beyond the immediate family. Everyone who knew Robert, everyone who worked his case, everyone who read about his disappearance in the paper, they all carried a piece of it with them. Some buried it deep and moved on. Others, like Linda, let it transform them. There's no right way to respond to senseless tragedy. We all do the best we can with the emotions we're given. In the years since Robert's discovery, advances in technology have made cases like his less likely to remain unsolved for decades. GPS tracking, cell phone location data, traffic cameras, social media, all of these create digital footprints that make it much harder for someone to simply vanish. If Robert had disappeared today instead of in 1982, his phone would have pinged cell towers. His taxi might have had GPS tracking. There might have been traffic cameras that captured his route. Search and rescue teams would have had access to drones, thermal imaging, and sophisticated mapping software. They probably would have found him within days, maybe hours. But progress in technology doesn't change the fundamental truth. Accidents still happen. People still die suddenly, leaving behind families who don't get to say goodbye. The tools change, but the loss remains the same. What the Leary case does demonstrate is the importance of never giving up. Linda could have accepted after a few years that Robert was probably dead and tried to move on with her life. She could have packed away his clothes, sold the house, started fresh somewhere new. Many people would have made that choice, and nobody would have blamed her. But she held on. She kept his memory alive, and when his body was finally found, she was still there to bring him home. That persistence mattered. The hunters who found Robert's taxi could have ignored that odd shape in the woods. They could have assumed it was just old farm equipment or natural rock formation and gone about their day. But David felt something was off, and he investigated. That curiosity, that willingness to check instead of dismiss, solved a 28-year-old mystery. Small actions matter. Paying attention matters. Being willing to look twice at something that doesn't seem quite right, that matters. Robert Leary's story has become something of a cautionary tale in missing persons circles. It's used in training for search and rescue teams, taught as an example of how cases can go cold not because of criminal sophistication, but because of simple geography and bad luck. It's reminded investigators to expand search parameters, to question assumptions, to look in unlikely places. How many other missing person cases might be solved if we applied these lessons more broadly? How many Robert Learys are out there, waiting to be found? Statistics suggest the answer is troubling. Thousands of people remain missing in the United States alone, their cases cold, their families living in the same painful limbo Linda experienced. Some percentage of those people are probably in situations similar to Robert's. They've died in accidents in remote locations, and their bodies simply haven't been found. They're not hiding. They're not being held. They're just lost, waiting for chance to reveal them. This raises uncomfortable questions about how we allocate resources for missing person cases. How long do you actively search before a case goes cold? How much money and manpower can you devote to one missing person when new cases keep coming in? These are impossible calculations, placing value on human life and human suffering in ways that feel wrong, no matter how you approach them. But they're real questions that law enforcement and search organizations face every day. Robert's case also highlights the changing nature of communities and how that affects investigations. In 1982, the town where Robert lived was smaller, more tight-knit. Everyone knew the taxi driver who'd vanished. But even then, with limited resources and technology, finding him proved impossible until chance intervened decades later. Today, our communities are often more diffuse, more transient. People move frequently. Neighbors don't always know each other. This can make investigating disappearances even harder. Witnesses move away. Memories fade faster. When there's no community to keep the story alive, potential leads disperse across the country. At the same time, technology creates new opportunities. Social media can spread information about missing persons to millions of people instantly. Crowdsourcing investigations can bring fresh eyes to cold cases. DNA databases can identify remains that would have stayed anonymous in previous decades. We're better at solving these mysteries than we've ever been, but they still happen, and they still devastate the people left behind. If there's a lesson in Robert Leary's story, it might be this: life is fragile in ways we don't think about every day. We say goodbye to people casually, assuming we'll see them again. Most of the time we're right. But sometimes we're not, and there's no way to know which goodbye will be the last one. That's not meant to be morbid or depressing. It's meant to be a reminder to appreciate the ordinary moments, the routine goodbyes, the mundane conversations that make up a life shared with others. Linda treasured that last meal with Robert, that final kiss goodbye, even though at the time it seemed like just another Thursday night. Now those memories are precious beyond measure, the last tangible connection to a life they'd built together. The other lesson, perhaps, is about the importance of closure. For 28 years, Linda lived with questions. Where was Robert? What had happened to him? Was he suffering somewhere? Had he chosen to leave? That not knowing was its own kind of torture, worse in some ways than grief, because it prevented her from fully processing the loss. When his body was finally found, when she finally had answers, She could begin to heal in ways that hadn't been possible before. Closure matters. Knowing matters. Even terrible truths are better than uncertain questions that never get answered. This is why families of missing persons often say they just want to know, even if the news is bad. They want their loved one found. They want to be able to mourn properly, to have a place to visit, to have definitive knowledge of what happened. The not knowing is unbearable in a way that even confirmed death somehow isn't. Some cases never get that resolution. Some families wait forever, their loved ones never found, questions never answered. They exist in permanent limbo, unable to move forward, but unable to give up hope. Think about them sometimes. Think about the families still waiting for their phone to ring with news, still checking databases for unidentified remains, still holding on to the smallest possibility that someone they love might come home. The statistics are grim. The longer someone is missing, the less likely they are to be found alive. After the first 72 hours, the odds drop significantly. After the first month, the outlook is bleak. After a year, most cases have gone cold. And yet families continue to hope, because what else can they do? Giving up feels like betrayal, like abandoning someone who might need them. So they wait, and they search, and they hold on, sometimes for decades. Robert Leary's family waited 28 years. Others have waited longer. Some are still waiting right now, reading this, wondering if their loved one will ever be found. To those people, Robert's story offers both comfort and frustration. Comfort in knowing that even after decades, discovery is possible. Cases can be solved. Bodies can be found. Answers can emerge from places nobody thought to look. But also frustration because it shouldn't take random chance. And 28 years. There should be better systems, better resources, better ways of finding people who've gone missing. The fact that we still rely so heavily on luck feels like a failure of imagination and will. We can send rovers to Mars, but we can't reliably find missing people in our own backyards. Something about that doesn't sit right, does it? The technology exists to do better. Ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging drones, satellite mapping. Artificial intelligence that can analyze terrain and identify likely locations for hidden vehicles or remains. These tools are available, but they're expensive and not widely deployed. Most search and rescue operations run on shoestring budgets with volunteer staff. They do remarkable work with limited resources, but imagine what they could do with proper funding and equipment. Robert Leary's case might have ended differently if those resources had been available in 1982. Or it might not have. Sometimes nature hides its secrets too well for any technology to easily reveal them. But we owe it to the missing and their families to try harder, to do better, to treat each case with the urgency it deserves. Every missing person is someone's Robert Leary. They're someone's husband or wife, someone's parent, someone's child. They matter, and finding them matters, even if it takes decades. Linda Leary lived long enough to see her husband found and properly laid to rest. Not everyone is that fortunate. She passed away in 2019, 7 years after Robert's discovery. Those final years of her life were marked by a peace she'd never experienced during all those decades of not knowing. She'd told friends she felt like she could finally breathe, like a weight had been lifted. The mystery that had defined her adult life was solved. She knew what had happened. She knew Robert hadn't left her intentionally. She knew he'd died quickly, that he hadn't suffered for long. These small mercies meant everything. At her funeral, people spoke about her strength, her devotion. her refusal to give up hope, even when everyone else had moved on. They spoke about how she'd transformed her pain into advocacy, helping other families navigate the nightmare of having a loved one disappear. She'd made a difference. She'd turned tragedy into purpose. If Robert could have seen what she became in those years after he vanished, he would have been proud. Their daughter still lives in the area, now with grandchildren of her own who've heard the story of the grandfather who disappeared before their mother was old enough to remember him. She visits Robert's grave regularly, sometimes bringing her children to sit in the grass and tell them about the man who drove a taxi and helped his neighbors and loved his family. She tells them about the 28 years of questions and the hunters who finally found him, and the strange, sad way closure sometimes arrives when you've almost given up on it. She tells them these things because memory matters, because Robert Leary was a real person who lived and worked and loved, and he deserves to be more than just a cautionary tale or a cold case file. He was someone's everything, and that should be remembered. This is what happens when someone vanishes. They become frozen in time, remembered as they were in that last moment before they disappeared. Robert never got to age, never got to watch his daughter graduate or walk her down the aisle or meet his grandchildren. He exists forever as a 34-year-old taxi driver in a work jacket, kissing his wife goodbye on a cold February night. That's all he'll ever be now, preserved in memory at that single moment in time. The truth about Robert Leary's disappearance was hiding in plain sight for 28 years, concealed only by distance and undergrowth, and the simple fact that nobody knew to look in that particular ravine on that particular stretch of rural road. There was no conspiracy, no elaborate crime, no mysterious villain, just weather and physics and terrible timing. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the right one, even when it takes decades to discover it. But here's what keeps me up at night, and maybe it'll do the same for you. How many other Robert Learys are out there right now? How many taxis or cars or trucks went off remote roads and were never found? How many families are still waiting, still wondering, still hoping for news that might come tomorrow or might never come at all? How many mysteries are solved only by the randomness of hunters walking in the right direction on an autumn morning? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, if those three friends had set up their equipment just a little bit differently that day, would Robert Leary still be missing? Would his family still be waiting? Would you and I be talking about an unsolved disappearance instead of a tragic accident? Sometimes the difference between mystery and resolution is nothing more than 30 yards and pure chance. Think about that the next time you drive down a lonely road. This disappearance mystery reminds us that cold case files can finally close decades later when vanished people are found after years of searching. Missing person cases like this show how unsolved mysteries become true crime stories that captivate us, not because of criminal investigation alone, but because they're real, life mysteries about ordinary people who disappeared without a trace. From missing persons cold cases to suspenseful stories of those vanished under mysterious circumstances, these narratives show that sometimes the truth behind unexplained disappearances is simpler than we imagine. If you're drawn to mystery thriller stories about disappeared persons and crime documentary content, subscribe for more shocking true crime and suspense stories about vanished without explanation cases that prove reality often surpasses fiction.